Thank you, Marissa, and thank you all for coming out to have lunch with me today. I appreciate that. This is a lunch and learn, we'll keep it sort of informal. I have some things that some comments that I will deliver to you all, but if you have any questions along the way, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy for this to be a bit of a dialogue if that's how it evolves. Whenever I go to hear book talks, one of the things that I am always really interested in is not just what's in the book, because presumably I have either read the book or I'm going to read the book, but I'm always really interested in the author's process and how they came to write the book that they're talking about. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today with you. But I'm also going to talk about the contents of the book and these 16 state historic sites. These are the sites that are owned and operated by the state of Georgia and are part of the state historic site system. So that's really the subject of this book, which is in essence a guidebook to those state historic sites. And I like to draw attention to the cover of this book because I just love the cover of this book, and I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't. There was a woman who works for UGA Press in Athens, and Anna Forrester, who I sent her some vague ideas for what I would like on the cover. I didn't want it to be just a photograph of one of the state historic sites because I love them all very much, and I didn't want one to be privileged over the others. And my friend Chop, who is over here in the gray sweatshirt, did kind of a sketch up of a design idea for me, and we sent it to UGA Press, and they came back with this cover design, which I think is very beautiful and evocative. So I always like to give a shout out to Anna Forrester and UGA Press for this. So, but anyway, to get into what inspired me to do this book. So there were a couple of things that happened. One was back around, I guess, 2015 or so, one day my mom announced to me that she wanted to visit all of Georgia's state historic sites. And when she said that to me, I was like, oh Lord. I mean, I'm a public historian and I love going to state historic sites, but at that time I had no idea how many there were in the state of Georgia, and I was thinking that there would be dozens and dozens of them. Well, as I sort of dug in, and there were some that I had visited, the ones in the sort of surrounding the metro Atlanta, Northwest Georgia area. But as I dug in to start planning our little odyssey of the state historic sites, I discovered that there really were only 16 that qualified as state historic sites. And so that sort of let me relax a little bit, and Mom and I began this process of visiting state historic sites. You see the picture here. I like to say this is Mom and my sister in their mafia sunglasses, because we look like some sort of mafia family there, except for me without my sunglasses, at the Little White House, which is the most visited of our state historic sites and probably one of the more famous. Well, unfortunately, before we could finish hitting all 16 of those sites, my mom passed away. And this was right before the pandemic hit, and then we got into the pandemic, and as all of you I'm sure know, everything sort of shut down. State historic sites shut down. I was still teaching at Kennesaw, but everything kind of came to a screeching halt. But as things started opening back up, and as I was looking for an activity to kind of get me out of my funk of that I was in after Mom had died and then the pandemic, I decided to go ahead and visit all these state historic sites, even though Mom was no longer around. And as I started exploring them, I discovered that there was no guidebook to the state historic sites. Like, there were a number of books that had been published about particular state historic sites. There was some stuff on the Chief Band House, there was some stuff on Wormslow, but there was not really any comprehensive book that talked about all of the sites. So as I was visiting everything, I started taking photographs and making notes and digging into archives, and decided that I would write a guidebook to the Georgia State Historic Sites. And one of the early things that I found as I was looking for through newspapers was this ad that you see that appeared in one of the Atlanta papers. It was an ad sponsored by Rich's Department Store, and this is where I got my title for the book. The ad says, "There's lots to see in Georgia," and this ad appeared in August of 1949, and it was right at the beginning of this era in Georgia where we were really promoting heritage tourism. So it's post-World War II. We're getting new highways. People have money again in the post-war era. And Georgia had decided that heritage tourism was going to be a key economic driver going forward. So in 1949, this ad appears. There are a number of sites that are mentioned here in this ad that either were already part of a state park system or would become part of the state historic site system. But this ad got me very excited, and I thought, this is a title to my book, my as yet not written book. Then as I continued to move along, my associate chair at Kennesaw and I were just sitting around chatting one afternoon about this idea of this book, and he was very excited about this book, and he said, you know, what you should really do is teach a research seminar and let students do some of the legwork on this book project. Which, so since it was almost impossible for me to get like a graduate research assistant, I thought, what a great idea. He was the person who scheduled our classes at Kennesaw, so we set up a research seminar class. And over the course of fall 2022, I had a group of students who adopted, each one adopted a state historic site for the duration of the semester. And they were responsible for doing research and writing what would become a first draft of some of the chapters of this book. So if you look through the book and you see some of the chapters are co-authored by someone other than me, that person was a student in my research seminar class. So you see Dr. Parker here, you see a partial roster from my class, and then central to this you see my cat Boomerang, who, as I say in the intro to the book or acknowledgments, was absolutely no help whatsoever on this project. She spent much of the time that I was writing this book, she sat right where you see her there, which was on top of a lot of the research materials that I had collected, or else she was running across my keyboard and causing a disruption. But she was great comfort to me in spite of her lack of assistance on production. So this was a sort of a great turning point for me to involve students in this project as well. And because I was able to get a small grant from the Dean's office at Kennesaw State University, that helped support having the students do field research. I was able to use some of that money to buy an annual pass for each of my students in the class, and so that enabled them to make multiple visits to their sites where they would interview various personnel at the sites, as well as explore archives at the sites, as well as explore the sites themselves. And then most of the records related to this, because they are all state historic sites, are actually held at the state archives down in Morrow. The staff at the state archives were terrific support for this project. I met with them a number of times over the summer, and then during the fall semester, on a Saturday, my class spent the entire day at the archives. In the morning, we did sort of a archive with training wheels kind of workshop where the staff helped the students understand how to do archival research, and then they spent the afternoon going through materials for their respective state historic sites at the state archives. So that's kind of the backstory of how this project came together. Excuse me. So these state historic sites are under the Department of Natural Resources in the Division of State Parks and Historic Sites in the state government. And the map that you see here shows the 63 state parks and historic sites that are owned and operated by the state of Georgia. And you can see what the responsibility is of this unit of the Department of Natural Resources, as well as the mission here. This is a system that is very much created in the 20th century. It is, the state park system is really organized in the 1930s, and then in 1951, 2 years after that Rich's ad about how much there is to see in Georgia comes out, the state created something called the State Historical Commission, which was responsible for identifying and designating these state historic sites. That entity would eventually evolve into becoming the Historic Preservation Division of the state of Georgia, and HPD, as we call it, has now been moved off into the Department of Community Affairs, and the Historical Commission would be abolished by Jimmy Carter, and a new entity was created, first the Heritage Trust, to acquire state historic sites in the early 1970s, and then it gets moved over. The Heritage Trust is eventually fades away, and all of these state historic sites are consolidated under the Division of State Parks and Historic Sites, which is where they are all managed today. So you can see here this list of when they're created. It's really the 1950s and 1960s when we kind of have the first rush of the designation of these sites. The state either acquires them or they're donated to the state. And then the Georgia Heritage Trust, which was created in 1973, is flush with money in 1974, and they buy a whole bunch of sites then. They're four really fantastic and important sites that are acquired by the Heritage Trust in 1974. That was their peak year of funding, and then they just kind of fade away. And then state parks and historic sites, since that was created, we've added 2 additional sites. So what I want to do now, the book is organized geographically because, again, it's a guidebook, and my thought was, if you're visiting these sites, you're probably not going to visit them thematically, you're probably going to visit sites that are in close proximity to each other, so that's why we organized the book the way we did. But if you're talking about these sites, it makes more sense to talk about them thematically. So I've used the categories as I'll go through the conversation here about this particular sites that the State Parks and Historic Sites Department actually uses to categorize them. And you'll see as we get close to the end that they sort of ran out of ideas or couldn't figure out how to classify some things. But anyway, we'll start off with our Native American sites, and there are 4 Native American sites. I should mention that all 16 of these sites are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and 6 of them are National Historic Landmarks. And you see 2 of those National Historic Landmarks here. That's Colomoki Mounds, which is down in Blakely, and the Etowah Indian Mounds, which is just near Cartersville. Colomoki Mounds is, I would say, the most remote from us of all of these state historic sites. It's way over on the western side of the state, almost in Alabama, just outside of Blakely. It's kind of so far off the beaten path that one of the times I went down there to visit, and I was talking with the site supervisor there, and she said, yeah, to come to Colomoki, you really have to want to come to Colomoki because it's so far from everything. It is a state historic site that's actually surrounded by a state park, so they get a lot of visitors who come to camp and fish and whatnot there. But this is a site that is considered one of the most well-preserved and most important woodland area Native American sites, certainly in the state of Georgia and throughout the Southeast. An interesting thing about Kolomoki was that most of the archaeology that was done there was done in the 1950s. It was done by a fellow named William Sears, who misdated this site as a Mississippian era site. So he had, because he could not believe that this large mound that you see here could have been built by people during the Woodland period. And it is something of an anomaly to have something a mound this large during the Woodland period. So he misdated it to about 1100, 1200 period, as opposed to the 600 CE period that was actually correct. And Sears was very well respected in the archaeological field. So after he misdated this site, nobody wanted to touch this site from the archaeology field, because there was an understanding among a lot of archaeologists in the field that Sears had messed up, but nobody wanted to publicly contradict him. So it's not until 1992 that Sears basically writes an article entitled Mea Culpa, in which he admits that he had misdated this site, and that really sort of reopened Kolomoki as a site for research and study by archaeologists. And in recent years, there's been an archaeologist from Florida who's been doing a lot of work there, who did his dissertation on it and has done a lot of additional work. So there's new information that's been discovered. One of the other interesting things about Kolomoki was in the 1970s, they had this little museum, and they had over 100 artifacts on display. These were things that had been uncovered in excavating some of the mounds, pottery and whatnot. And over a weekend, somebody broke into the museum and stole 124 artifacts out of that museum. Over the years, they were able to find about 16 of those artifacts. They were very much unique to this particular site, and brought those back. And up until about a year and a half ago, those artifacts were on display at the museum. They've now been repatriated to the Muskogee Creek tribe, as have all of the Native American artifacts at these Native American sites in Georgia. Etowah is another example of this. So Kolomoki is really our most ancient of sites. Again, it's from the Woodland era. Dates from about 300 to about 800. It was occupied at a number of different times. It has this large mound surrounded by a number of other smaller mounds, and now a museum that has been stripped of much of its artifacts. Etowah is a Mississippian era mound site. I'm sure some of you have visited this site. It has one of the largest mounds in the southeast, what they call Mound A. Etowah was right in the middle of the Mississippian period, occupied a number of different times. It was an important chiefdom at some point. By the time Hernando de Soto comes through Georgia, Etowah was still occupied, but it was a sub-chiefdom of a larger chiefdom nearby. And it really gets wiped out by these Spanish conquistadors who come through in the 1500s. So that's kind of the death of Etowah as an occupied Native American site. And then we have two Cherokee sites here. The Chief Van House, which was a plantation that was developed by Chief James Van, and then later by his son Joseph Van. Van was one of the wealthiest chiefs in the Cherokee Nation. He developed this plantation in the early 1800s. James Van was a very bad man. He was prone to drink and violence, and he was assassinated. And after his death, there was actually much rejoicing by a lot of the folks who lived on this plantation. And then his young son took over the plantation and really developed it and built the brick house that is there today. This is a great site that back, I guess, about 10 or 12 years ago, historian and Taya Miles began doing some research into this site and did a lot of work on the history of enslavement at the Van House. And as a result of Taya's work, one of the rangers there at the Van House developed an interpretive space exhibit about the enslaved people at the Van House. So that was, I think, a big improvement in the interpretation that they do there at the Van House. And then lastly, we have New Echota, which is largely a reconstruction of the last of the Cherokee capitals in the southeast. This was what was the capital of the Cherokee Nation at the time of Cherokee removal, which happens in the 1830s. And there is one building that was original to the site and a number of other buildings that have either been moved to the site that are original to the Cherokee period, or they are reconstructions of buildings that were there, things like the courthouse, the print shop. This was the place where the Cherokee Phoenix was printed, which was an important newspaper for the Cherokee people. We also have a number of sites along the Georgia coast. The coastal forts in colonial Georgia is how the state system classifies these. Of these, Fort King George is a reconstructed fort that is something that was, it was an outpost during the time before the Georgia colony is actually created. And it represented the southernmost outpost of the British Empire in North America for a number of years. So this area between South Carolina and Florida was called the debatable land. So it was always kind of up for grabs who was really controlling this land. Of course, there were Native American people living there, and as far as they were concerned, it was theirs. But the English and the Spanish were always vying for control over this land. And then actually, the thing that the English feared more than the Spanish were the French, because the French occupied Louisiana, what eventually becomes the Louisiana Purchase. And the English were always afraid that the French were going to come in through various waterways to establish a French port along the Atlantic coast, because the only coastal area that the French controlled at that point was like from New Orleans on down, what we know as Louisiana. So Georgia felt, or Britain felt very strongly about establishing some sort of outpost along the Atlantic coast to keep the French and the Spanish at bay, and mostly to protect the Carolina colonies. So they sent a fellow named Captain John Barnwell down the coast, and he found a spot on the Altamaha River that he thought was a good spot for an outpost, although after he established that post, he went south a little bit more and found a spot that would eventually become Fort Frederica, which is a national park site, and decided that was a better spot. But he'd already started work here at this place that becomes Fort King George. He had asked for a whole bunch of young, able-bodied soldiers to go with him down there to help build this fort. And what he got was a bunch of scurvy-ridden, drunken people who he found very difficult to get them to do any work. He ended up bribing them to get them to actually cut the timber to build this fort. But anyway, eventually Fort King George gets built in the early 1700s. It was the worst post you could possibly have in the British Empire in North America. There was nothing but like disease and death in this area, and the occasional Indian attack as well. So almost everybody who gets posted there dies. Eventually, it was decided that it just was not worth really maintaining this fort. It burned, they rebuilt it, They rebuilt it with substandard materials. It was sort of falling apart. In the early 1720s, Britain really abandons this fort except for 2 guys. They leave 2 sentries down there to man the fort and sort of keep an eye out to make sure the French and Spanish don't encroach on their empire. And though for 7 years, there were 2 guys sitting down there at Fort King George, which again, worst place you could possibly be posted in the British Empire, before they completely abandoned it. The site of this fort is kind of lost to history for many years because the lumber industry takes off. 1733, of course, Oglethorpe arrives and begins developing the Georgia colony and goes down and sets up Fort Frederica on what becomes St. Simon's Island, and Fort King George would become obsolete, and that site gets lost to history, and it's rediscovered in the 20th century, and slowly over time gets rebuilt and becomes part of the state system. Well, in the sort of as we're approaching the celebration of the bicentennial, the Division of State Parks and Historic Sites decides that we need a Revolutionary War site in our state parks and historic sites system. And they weren't quite sure what to do about this until they came upon a site right near where the historic town of Sunbury was located. And this was a site that was an American Revolutionary War fort, and then a War of 1812 fort, and it gets reused a little bit during the Civil War as a Confederate stronghold. But the important thing was this adjacent town of Sunbury, which does no longer exist, but in its heyday, the time period leading up to the Revolutionary War, Sunbury was the second most important port of the Georgia colony, second only to Savannah. There were over 100 people who lived there. It was a town that was developed on a grid plan, much like Savannah was. And so it was important to defend this port when the Revolutionary War broke out. Fort Morris was eventually captured by the British and occupied by the British. Then the fort is abandoned after the war. And then during the War of 1812, it's sort of rebuilt because the barracks had been burned and the earthworks were rebuilt. But by the time we get into the 20th century, really all that's left is sort of the outline of these mounds. There's a lot of archaeological work done at this site until it's eventually actually affirmatively dated to the Revolutionary War period with the fort of 1812 kind of built on top of it. And so that's our American Revolutionary War site in the system. And then there's Wormslow. Anybody ever been to Wormslow? Wormslow is probably, Wormslow and Little White House vie for the title of most visited of our state historic sites. One of the most fabulous things at Wormslow is this alley of trees that you see here. These were trees that was planted by a descendant of Noble Jones, who Noble Jones came over on the boat with Oglethorpe. So he was one of these original settlers of the Georgia colony. He was a man of many occupations. He was trained as a doctor. He was a carpenter. He was also a surveyor. He was the person who was charged with surveying the lots for the city of Savannah, although he got fired from that job because apparently he wasn't working fast enough to suit the trustees. His complaint was he didn't have enough help to actually do the work efficiently. But Noble Jones develops this plantation of Wormslow, and during his time he built a tabby house, basically a house that was surrounded by a tabby fort at Wormslow, and you can still see those ruins of Noble Jones's tabby fort. He dies shortly before the Revolution. His son, Noble Jones, actually becomes known as the Morning Star of the American Revolution. While his father had been loyal to the crown, the son actually becomes one of the real leaders of the revolutionary faction in the Georgia colony during the Revolutionary War. Wormslow was owned by 5 generations of the same family before it is finally acquired by the Heritage Trust in the 1970s. So there was a long history of this family owning this land. Noble Jones did not actually live on the land that much because he had other properties around, and there's still a part of this where the descendants of Noble Jones live. It's a part that's adjacent to the part that's a state historic site, and there's the family home there, and they still live there on this property in Wormslow. As you would expect, we have a number of Civil War sites. The oldest of these in terms of being established as part of the system, and also just in terms of being developed at all, is the home of Alexander Stephens, who was a politician from Georgia, a lawyer and politician, probably Georgia's most famous politician from the 19th century. In addition to serving in the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, he also served as the Vice President of the Confederacy. If you go and visit the A.H. Stephens State Park, you will get a full-on lost cause informed tour, where they will tell you that Alexander Stephens was opposed to secession, which he was. What they don't tell you is why he was opposed to secession. He wasn't opposed to secession because he was an abolitionist. He was opposed to secession because he felt like the U.S. Constitution protected the institution of slavery. So he was, in sort of an interesting bedfellows kind of story, he served in the U.S. House of Representatives alongside Abraham Lincoln. And he and Abraham Lincoln actually were fairly cordial, and there's some interesting correspondence between the two of them. They didn't agree on this issue of slavery, but there was a lot that they did agree on, and they actually had great admiration for each other. And so Stephens felt like when Lincoln was elected, that did not really mean the death knell for slavery in the South. So he very much advocated against secession by the state of Georgia. Georgia did, of course, secede. Stephens goes on to actually serve as Vice President of the Confederacy. He and Jeff Davis hated each other. They didn't get along. So during much of his time as Vice President, he actually spent time here at his home in Crawfordville rather than in Richmond, because he really didn't feel like he had a place in the Davis administration. Stephens, of course, would very famously give a speech in March, just a couple of months after Georgia had seceded in 1861, that became known as the Cornerstone Speech, in which he talked about how slavery was the cornerstone of the Confederacy. So any notion that Georgia was not seceding over the issue of the preservation of slavery is completely blown out of the water by Stephens' speech. Stephens was imprisoned briefly after the war in Massachusetts, and then came back home to this property which he called Liberty Hall, and he actually tore down the house that was there before and built the house that you see there today in the 1870s, and that is where he lived up until the time that he died. He was actually serving as the governor of Georgia at the time of his death. There was a big effort in the 1890s by the United Daughters of the Confederacy to preserve this site, and some of his relatives got involved in this effort, and so this becomes really the first state historic site that's established in the 1930s as part of a state park. The other two sites here are Civil War battlefields. There's Fort McAllister, which is down out just south of Savannah, It was an earthen fort that guarded the mouth of the Ogeechee River and protected Savannah, which was 12 miles upriver during the war. And then Pickett's Mill battlefield, which is not too far from Kennesaw, actually, and was the site of brutal fighting during part of Sherman's march towards Atlanta. Pickett's Mill was the site of a Confederate victory. It was known as a strategic blunder by the U.S. Army, so much so that up until fairly recently, the U.S. Army used to actually take their troops out there and show them this battlefield and talk about why this battle was such a strategic blunder by the U.S. Army. The Confederates had the high ground. The U.S. troops came up through a ravine and were just slaughtered. It was a site that is actually fairly well preserved in terms of earthworks and whatnot. It was owned for a number of years by the Kraft Paper Company, so they logged it pretty heavily, but then they donated it to the state, and what you see there now is essentially what that landscape would have looked like during the time of the battle in May of 1864. There's one site affiliated with the gold rush, and that's the old courthouse in Dahlonega. This courthouse dates to 1836. The gold rush, of course, is a contributing factor in Cherokee removal as well, so that story is told here at the courthouse. This represents Georgia's sort of first major, actually the United States' first major gold rush. It happens in the 1820s. This area in and around Dahlonega becomes what was described as a lawless land, as all these people filter in and start panning for gold. So the courthouse is built in a town that is established known as Dahlonega. It comes from a Native American word, Talanaga. And this is the building that we see today. It was basically donated to the state after a new courthouse was built in Dahlonega, and the museum there has recently been renovated, so the exhibits have been updated, and it really does a great job of telling the story of the gold rush and Cherokee removal in Georgia. There are two houses that are under this category of plantations. The first one is Hawful-Brawfield Plantation. It's down just outside of Brunswick. This is the only plantation, former rice plantation, that has actually been preserved and is interpreted as such. And it too was actually owned by essentially one family from 1806 until the 1970s. So there were 5 generations of the Brailsford family that owned this particular plantation. The last resident here was a woman named Olivia Dent, and she actually set up a deal so that when she passed away, the site would actually come to the state of Georgia, and this is one of the things that's unusual about these sites. She actually provided a little bit of an endowment for the ongoing preservation and interpretation of this site. If you go to visit this site, the house with the red roof here is the big house at this site. It dates to about the 1850s. This operated as a rice plantation. You can still see the marshes that were the rice field there out in front of the house. And it operated until the early 20th century as a rice plantation. By that time, growing rice in this area was actually a losing proposition because the rice culture had moved west and had become much more mechanized. The Dent sisters and their brother actually converted this to a dairy farm operation. And Olivia Dent and her sister ran a dairy here where they provided milk to the millionaires who were living on Jekyll Island and folks in the Brunswick area. Olivia's 1970 Oldsmobile Cutlass is still sitting there in the garage, If you go and visit this, it's like she just, left to go out to get groceries or something. And occasionally somebody will write in the dust on the hood of the car, "Wash me," because, it's sitting there in the garage and getting dusty. The other plantation is Gerald Plantation, which is a site that was owned by the Gerald family. The Gerald family comes to Jones County in the 1850s. Although the family claims this house that you see here dates to 1847, but the deed is not filed until the 1850s, so it's possible that this house dates to the late 1840s. Over the years, they industrialized their site, so they went from growing cotton and operating a cotton gin to a syrup mill and then a lumber mill, and so this stayed in the Jones family through multiple generations until it was finally donated to the state of Georgia. And it's this remarkable collection of buildings and resources that take you from the 1850s to the really sort of the mid-20th century. And then we get into this category where, again, the state has sort of run out of ideas of how to clump things together, and they call it unique homes. Hardman Farm is the most recent addition to the state historic sites. It opened in 2014. It's the house that dates to the 1860s. It was built by a gentleman named James Nichols. But the really important period for this house was in the 20th century when Georgia Governor Lamartine Hardman owned this house. And the Hardman family owned this house. Governor Hardman and then his descendants, his children, owned this house up into the 1990s, I guess, when they finally sold it to the state of Georgia. Hardman used it as a summer residence. He developed scientific farming on this property and ran a dairy here. It's very close to Helen, Georgia. Like, you can walk to downtown Helen from this site. There's actually a little trail that takes you from there. And it's a really fantastic site. Travelers Rest is a site. It was a stagecoach stop. It was really developed by a fellow named Devereux Jarrett in the first part of the 19th century, and it became famous as one of the best stagecoach stops along the Unicoi Turnpike. Descendants of the Jarrett family owned this property well into the 20th century, and until Mary Jarrett White actually sold it to the state of Georgia. And it is very much an intact building. It's massive. It's got outbuildings along with it. Unfortunately, it's only open like 2 days a week. I think like Fridays and Saturdays, or maybe Saturdays and Sundays now. And it's very lightly staffed. There's one volunteer who's responsible for staffing Travelers Rest. And then lastly, we have the Little White House, which of course was Franklin Roosevelt's retreat outside of Warm Springs. Roosevelt was afflicted with polio in 1921, and then he was desperate to find some sort of place for treatment. He discovered Warm Springs. There was a resort at Warm Springs where a number of people had come for treatment from the effects of polio. And this became one of his favorite places, so much so that he actually bought the resort in 1926 for $195,000, which represented the bulk of his fortune. So he bought the resort, he redeveloped the resort as a treatment center for folks with polio, and he built this little house that you see here that became known as the Little White House. Of course, it was here where he was sitting for a portrait, which becomes known as the unfinished portrait, where he died in April of 1945. Little White House probably has the most extensive museum of any of these state historic sites. They built a new facility there, a new museum facility, not too long ago, and it's it's a really fantastic museum where you can learn about not just Roosevelt, but also about Georgia, history in Georgia during the Depression and World War II. But you can also visit the house, of course. So those are the sites. I will say that during the process while I was working on this book, our special projects unit at Kennesaw State got the project with the state, with DNR, to actually develop new brochures for all of these state historic sites. So this was really sort of some synchronicity, because I was the person who was going out to visit all the sites, so I was gathering a lot of the research materials and photographs that we ended up using in some of these brochures. Prior to this, if you would go and visit these sites, some of them would hand you a photocopied sheet of paper, and some of them would hand you a glossy brochure, but there was no standardization across the system. So now we have standardization across the system. If you go to these sites, you'll get a brochure that looks like this. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about something that I feel very strongly about, and that is, this is a system that was developed in the 20th century, mostly between the 1950s and 1970s, and it very much reflects that sensibility. There's nothing really about women's history. There's nothing about civil rights history in Georgia, which was an epicenter of the civil rights movement. There's some of the interpretation, like at the Stevens house, for instance, at Pickett's Mill, is pretty reflective of that 1950s to 1970s period. And I really would like to see the system update its interpretation, especially at the Civil War sites. The Cherokee sites, the Van House has sort of done the best of this based on Ty Miles' research. And the site superintendent at Hoffel Broadfield has actually done a lot of work to try to incorporate more information about the enslaved workers and whatnot at their site. But some of these other sites are really sort of begging for an update. So that's the overview of these sites. I hope you will all go visit these sites. I encourage you to take the book with you. If you go to the DNR website, you can find information about all these sites in terms of when they're open and how much they cost and whatnot, but you won't find any information about the history of these sites. So the thing that the book does is it provides you the history of what happened at each of these sites, as well as how each site became part of the state system. Because to me, that's equally as interesting. And then there's a section on how you navigate the site. So is there a museum there? What do you need to make sure that you see? So it is truly a guidebook to these sites that are part of the state system. So questions, comments, anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Well, could you talk about Dorchester?
Dorchester, yes. This is, I've been quietly campaigning for DNR to get them in. Frankly, DNR has no money. All these sites are understaffed and underfunded, and so I realize I'm like sort of whistling in the wind when I say we need to add this. Dorchester Academy was a place where an African-American school was established in the 1870s, and it carries us right on into the 20th century, and it became a training center during the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King would have stayed in his dormitory. So this was, this building that you see here does not date to the original school from the 19th century, but this site is, I think, a really rich site in terms of civil rights history, and would be a great candidate for addition to the state system. Right now, it seems to be kind of owned, I won't say operated, but it's owned by a local nonprofit, and they have no money. So there are a few interpretive signs out there, but the building's not open. You can't really see anything much there. And I think this would be a great place to tell the story of the civil rights movement in Georgia, which is a huge part of our history. I mean, we have the Martin Luther King National Historical Park, which is a national park site, but we don't have anything in our state system that's related to civil rights. So it's just outside of Midway, Georgia. If you look at the map that's in the book, you'll see that there's a big desert in terms of historic sites, kind of in the center of the state. You know, there's a big cluster along the coast, and then there's sort of this northwest Georgia cluster, and then there's a little cluster kind of to the east, but nothing in the center. We used to have the Jeff Davis capture site used to be part of the state system. It's very lightly visited. It is, I would say, maybe not worth the trip. It's down near Irwinville. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's the place where Jeff Davis was captured by the U.S. Army as he was fleeing to try to head south and west to set up an auxiliary Confederate government or whatever. The state unloaded that onto Irwin County back in the 1980s, I believe, when they were kind of rearranging some things. But yeah, I would love to see Dorchester Academy added to the list. Yes, ma'am.
Questions about your students. You sent them to the far corners of Georgia.
Yes.
What kinds of reactions do they have?
I think for them it was a big adventure for the most part. The one thing that they told me, because I was trying to get them to provide first drafts for something that I could revise and put in the book, I gave them very sort of strict guidelines about how they needed to create this research paper. The research seminar is one of the required courses for history majors where they have to produce a 15 to 20 page research paper of doing, you know, original primary source research. So this was perfect in terms of, they had to go to the archives, they had to go to each site has its own little archive, they had to interview people, so they were building all these research skills. The thing that almost all the students told me, they had to take 2 of these research seminars, because over time we've discovered if they do one, they're not really developing their skills. So most of them had already taken one research seminar class, and they were very appreciative of the very strict guidelines that I gave them. They said, this is like bowling with bumpers instead of like, you know, my ball going in the gutter all the time, because it gave them a structure within which to work instead of just, a lot of professors will just say, this is a research seminar on Georgia history and do whatever you want, and the students are paralyzed. They're like, I have no idea. And inevitably they take a topic that's way too big or something where there's no primary sources or whatever. This, I knew there were primary sources. They got to go and visit the site, which college students love nothing more than a field trip. Like, you know, they do all these field trips when they're in high school or middle school or whatever, elementary school, and they get to college and they never leave the classroom. And I always make my students go out and visit places, whether it's this class or any other class, and that is inevitably the highlight for them. They're like, I got to go see things. So the students loved it, I think. They loved going out to visit the places. They really embraced it. I would say their writing ability was somewhat uneven. I was fortunate that I actually got course releases in the fall of 2023, I guess, which I used to do all the revisions for this book, because I had to do a lot of rewriting. But the students really did the primary source research for me. So it was a great experience from that perspective. And all the students got a free copy of the book, and they were very excited about that. So, and you know, one of the students was in the military. He was stationed in Germany by the time the book came out, and they got a copy of the book. UGA Press got a copy of the book to him in Germany, and he emailed me, and he was so excited because he had gotten the book, and this was like 2 years after he took the class. So all these kids had graduated by the time the book came out. It's a slow process, let me tell you, getting something published. It took you know, a while. So anyway, other questions? Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And then the most recent edition was 2014. Does DNR, or do they have a kind of like cutoff date of what is considered historical, kind of as we get further into the 21st century, looking back at Olympic era or
Yeah.
70s part?
They generally use what the National Park Service uses, which is 50 years. But I know from working with them off and on for a number of years that they really are not planning to add anything to the system now, which is very sad to me, but they just are underfunded. The parks side is very lucrative for the state. The historic site side is not. So people use the parks much more heavily and are more willing to pay for the parks than they are to pay to visit a state historic site. I mean, you get an annual pass, which is well worth it if you want to go visit these sites. I mean, I get an annual pass every year because I just go to these sites because I'm a big history nerd. But anyway, but in terms of what they would look at, they look for sites, historically, they were looking for sites that were already listed on the National Register, or in some cases, they help facilitate getting the sites listed on the National Register as part of the process of bringing it into the state system. Other questions? Yeah.
How much are you able to bring the system to the 21st century? Are you able to impact that at all through this work, or is it reflected in the book at all?
I would say it's not reflected so much in the book, and in terms of any sort of influence, probably had more impact working on the brochure project, in that we were able, if you go back and you look at this, you can see that there's some information for Alexander Stevens. They're still giving this tour. The main docent there at Liberty Hall very proudly will tell you that she was trained by the members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy on this tour, on how to give the tour, and she is like verbatim what they told her to say. But we were able to incorporate some information on some of the enslaved people here into the brochure. So that was really important to us, to try to move the needle a little bit through the brochures, even if it wasn't, there wasn't much change happening. The other thing that was sort of starting to happen was were just implementing a new outdoor signage program within the system. So you'll see in some of the sites, they may have installed new signage since I wrote the book, or since the book came out, that incorporates a more diverse view of things. So that's kind of, I mean, I had a long conversation with the site superintendent at Hawful Broadfield, and he had all these great ideas and was very ambitious about what he wanted to do. But again, it's a matter of money. So he's in the process of writing a grant to be able to completely redo their museum exhibits. And he wanted to take what had historically been a slave cabin, and then had been a tenant farmer cabin that was behind the big house, and in the 20th century got converted into a public restroom. He wanted to take that back to what it was like prior to emancipation and interpret that slavery story in that space. So I haven't been back down there in the last year or so, and so I don't know where he is in terms of funding for that, but that's kind of the direction. So in some ways it sort of depends on the individual site supervisors and how ambitious they are and how much they can go out and find funding for them. Yeah, yes, sir.
There are two I do not know if they're no longer included in this source.
So, sorry?
There are two that are not listed here. I do not know if they're not included in this source.
Which?
Patterson and Thomasville and Tombstone and Washington.
Right, so both of those are no longer operated by the state. The Tombs House has been given over to the county, and it's operated locally. Lapham Patterson is still owned by DNR, but it is operated locally by the Historical Society in Thomasville. So it's no longer, you will find it, depending on where you go in the website, you will find it listed, is basically listed as like an affiliate site. So that was sort of the boundary that I set for this book, were the ones that were owned and operated by the state. So, I mean, you know, the Jeff Davis site is listed as an affiliate site as well. It's just, but it's owned and operated by Woodland County now. And the last time I was down there, like they had all this sort of counterfactual literature they were selling, like, what if the Confederacy had won, kind of stuff. And I was like, you know, so it's probably a good thing the state is not really endorsing that site at this point, I would think, in terms, it's fairly ahistorical, I think, in terms of their interpretation of things there. So, other questions, comments? I know a couple of people asked me if I would be willing to sign books, which I'm happy to do. If you want to stick around for a minute, we've got our booksellers in the back. Yeah, so you can actually buy a copy today. And again, thank you all for coming today. I love talking about this book. I've done a number of books over my career, and this is absolutely my favorite one that I've ever done because it was just fun to work on, and I got to include students, and also I still use it. Like I, go and visit these sites, and I look at the book, and wish I could do an update sometimes. But I mean, right as I was about to go to press on this book, the state of Georgia finally started adhering to the NAGPRA federal law and repatriating these grave goods to the Muskogee Creek tribe. So the Etowah Museum went from having all these artifacts in it to having nothing in terms of artifacts other than the mounds that are outside the building. So it's been interesting to watch these transitions happen. So, yes. The tribe has them. They are sort of processing everything in their collection. I mean, they got a lot of stuff back. There were over 400 burials that were dug up at the Etowah site, and most of that stuff was in storage at the University of West Georgia. So, they haven't decided yet what they're going to do, if they're going to try to reinter those folks at the Etowah site or bury them in Oklahoma or what they're going to do. So I think that the tribe is still working on what they're going to do with all of this. So, I don't know. I remember when I was a child, we went on, elementary school field trip to Etowah Indian Mounds, and there were human remains on display. I don't know if any of you've been to Etowah, you may remember this. It was like they had like this burial, and there was like a piece of glass over it, and you could see the skeleton that was, in the ground. That made I remembered nothing else about visiting Etowah Indian Mounds as a child. Those human remains stayed on display until the 1990s. So, that's not the case anymore. I mean, you see that, it's somebody's grave, right? So, maybe not the best, but anyway, it's the whole thing is an interesting case study if you look at these sites in terms of the evolution of what is acceptable in terms of interpretation and preservation of a historic site. So, there are a lot of changes that have happened. Hopefully more changes will be coming in the right direction. So, anyway. So go out and visit the sites, buy the book, give the book as a gift to get other people to go visit the sites. So, any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming.